I work with a museum in New York State where the tour guides sometimes are offered monetary tips as a way for a guest to show their appreciation for a job well done. My director has said that employees are required to turn those tips over to the museum. I haven't had a chance to check with the Department of Labor yet to see if this is legal, but since it seems like our tour guides are offering a service, they should be allowed to keep those tips. What do you think?
So I love that this came from New York State, and I love that you put New York State in here because you made this question so much more complicated.
Oh boy.
New York State, not only is there very robust law in New York State about tipping and how tips are supposed to be handled, it's actually different in different parts of New York State. So depending on what county you're in, the Department of Labor has different rules about what the level that the payments can be made and whether or not you're allowed to pool tips and all kinds of other interesting things. So one, I would say this is a perfect example. This is a perfect time to reach out to an attorney that is familiar with the exact locality in New York State that you're in that can give you the exact right answer. But as a general rule for most of New York State, and because you said employee in here, like our employees absolutely 100% keep the tips they're given. There is no rule. It's illegal for an employee to take your tips away from you in New York State. You do not have to give those tips back.
Really?
The employer, really.
I'm shocked.
Well, I mean, that's true in most places. That's true in most places. So the employer can have a rule that says we pool tips, and that the employer can make you pool tips. The employer can allow the employees to decide that they want to pool tips. So there are different ways you can handle it. And because it's New York State, right? There's so many nuances to it that you want to figure out exactly the scenario you're in. But I can say categorically that no, employees are not required to turn over tips to the museum unless the museum is pooling those tips and giving them back out to employees in a different way. And the reason pooling tips exists is, right, so like in a restaurant, the waiter gets the tip, but the dishwasher doesn't get any tips, but you want the dishwasher to be eligible for tips too. So you pool it so that everybody gets a fair share of tips. But in this case, I think you need to talk to an attorney.
So I'm going to be really naive here. I'm wondering, you made the point, and I had this, I sort of thought about this when I read the question, because we're talking about employees, do all the rules change if it's not an employee and this is just a volunteer who's a tour guide?
It's hard to say because the statute in New York State has the word employee in it.
Okay.
So it talks about what employees are responsible for and what employers are responsible for, because it's the Department of Labor that's making the rules. Once it's a volunteer, I don't think that there's no necessarily any rules about it. So it could be, and again, this would be a great question for an attorney to see, like, does being a volunteer change labor law? Like, because you're volunteering for an organization, does that like say that everything that says employee, employer, does that relationship difference make the laws different? Which is sort of so beyond the scope of what you and I are capable of answering.
Oh God, yes.
We can sort of point, and that's one of the things that Stacey and I are good at, right? We can point out that like there's a problem here. There's a question, but we can't give you a categorical answer at all.
No. I'm curious to know, I'm just more, okay, I know that we need to answer this. This needs to be answered by a legal professional, okay? And someone who knows all this. I'm curious philosophically where you stand on this, Andy. Let's take it away from New York State. That's very complicated with all the rules and laws around this. Like, theoretically and just philosophically in the nonprofit sector, if there is a position that is a tour guide that, you know, the person is hired by the nonprofit to be a good tour guide and gets a tip, where do you stand on that? Like with what they do with that money? Like if there were no laws, like, okay, I'm going to just do imagination here for a minute. Where would you stand?
I think it depends on the situation, right? So when I worked at the food bank, I gave tours all the time. Like the number of times someone offered me, and my tours were pretty good, but the number of times that someone offered me a tip at the end of my tours was zero. Right. But that's because it's sort of an inappropriate thing.
Yeah.
Like I'm just giving a tour of a food bank. It's not like I'm giving a tour of an art collection or a historic house or something of cultural significance that would require me to have done a lot of research and have a lot of knowledge about what it is I'm talking about. Like you see lots of volunteer docents, like in a smaller nonprofit,
Right.
historic house, volunteer docent that goes and tells stories. And so you may pay an admission to get into the thing, but if that person did a really, really good job, there's nothing preventing a tourist or somebody, a visitor, from handing that person $5 saying, I really appreciated the tour. Thanks for doing it. The intention of the person that gave you the money has, to me, that has weight. They didn't put it in the dolphin or whatever at the front of the house that's got,
That's a good
a
point.
slot to be able to stick dollars in.
That's a good point.
They handed it to the volunteer,
That's
right?
a good point.
And they didn't say this is for conservation of the whatever that would restrict it to a donation to the museum. Specifically, they're giving it to because they thought it was a good tour. So for me, like from a like, if we take law out of it completely and what are the rules about what are you allowed to do, I would come down on if you gave a really, really good tour and somebody felt like giving you $20. And that's up to you to decide what you want to do with that $20. It shouldn't be the museum, my opinion, saying, "Oh no, that has to go into the maintenance fund for the electric bill or whatever." Right? That doesn't seem fair.
I have just never thought this deeply about this topic, and so thank you for the question, because it started unraveling in my brain, going, okay, so. Would it ever be appropriate, perhaps, for it to go back to the organization? Anyway, thank you for giving me something to think about. I still don't know exactly where I land on it. I think you made a really good point, though, Andy, about when I'm tipping someone, it's because I'm giving it to them and not to the organization's, as you said, dolphin bucket up front or whatever that is. So yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction that. Again, we talk about honoring intent, right? In the fundraising world, honoring donor intent. I mean, this is a little bit different, but it's honoring intent. So anyways, thank you for the question and best of luck. Once you find out the answer, let us know how it lands, because I'm super curious.
Yeah, we will totally provide. If you let us know if you hear from an attorney and you get an actual answer, let us know and we'll report back for everybody.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Hey, nonprofit leaders and change makers. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Nonprofit Everything. I am Stacey Wedding and my fabulous co-host, Andy Shurick. We love doing this for you, and I hope you love it as much as we do. We actually get energy off of it. Before we have to record these, we always have a little bit of malaise and a little bit of like, oh gosh, do we have this big chunk of time? And then I know I get energized. Andy, you?
I do. I feel the same way. I think we've said it before. Like, it's like, oh, okay, look at what's on my calendar. Now we have to like do this. And then once we start, it's lovely to talk to Stacey for a couple hours. I love it.
It is. It's fun and it's great. And I always learn something from Andy and all his wisdom. So hopefully you learn a few things from us as well. Anyways, you know how to reach us. So this is another great episode, jam-packed with lots of good questions and hopefully some halfway decent answers or things that at least get you thinking. But you know that it is your questions that make the magic happen. So make sure to find us, nonprofiteverything.com, different social media channels, or if you have a relationship with Andy and I, track us down and let us know your question and we'll make sure to include it. Thank you as always for listening.
I've been elected as the secretary for a nonprofit board I serve on. Our prior secretary took care of all the minutes, but I have friends who serve on other boards and have said that the staff takes care of the minutes. Can you provide clarity for me on whether I should be the one handling the minutes, or should I be delegating this to staff, as well as key things I need to include in the minutes?
Well, so the first thing that sort of was a big trigger for me, and I just want to clarify, maybe it was just word choice, right? But you as a board member are not going to, unless you are having a conversation with your executive director to see if the ED is willing to have someone on staff take minutes, you are not going to delegate this to staff. So sorry, this is obviously you hit a hot button. I'm sorry for that, but yeah, you're not going to. That's not appropriate or important, for a board member to just delegate to staff, unless it's more of a conversation with the board chair or ED or whatever. Like, hey, this might help. Short, one answer to that is that there's a lot of organizations. It used to be kind of considered really like, I think it was antiquated, and that no, you're a board secretary and that's your role. And I think you've even I've seen some of the premier sources on all things boards and who've done a lot of research and study around best practice recognize the reality is sometimes it probably makes more sense to have a staff member take them and try and do an initial draft and send it to you as a board member. So it's not a yes or no. It's absolutely acceptable if your organization chooses to go that way. So I guess that's the first thing I would say is just you have to figure out and just have that conversation. Or if it's something where you're like, I think I'm a secretary and I'm better skilled at refining or tweaking something versus starting it from scratch and notes from scratch, right? So I kind of think that's a piece of it. And I also just think one of the things obviously to include in the minutes, I feel like, some of the basics that probably many would repeat, and share would be where was the date and time of the meeting? Was it a virtual meeting? What's the name of your organization, right? Which board members were present, which were absent? Did a board member come in late? Did you have a quorum? What motions were made and by whom? Which motion, what got approved, and was there anybody who was dissenting or recused themselves, and you'd put the name of that person. So sort of some of those kind of key from a legal perspective and just a historical perspective, capturing some of that. So, voting results for abstainers and dissenters, noting if you decided on, you don't have to go into, I've seen this happen all too often. And Andy, I don't know if you've seen these, right? You have two types of minutes that people get into trouble with, right? You've got the minutes that barely have anything and just talk, oh, we had a motion and it was approved. And there's 5 motions and that's all that are in their minutes. And there's no other context. And that's not good because there's no, again, you don't have sort of that richness of the discussion, or if someone raised some good questions or there was even a debate that needs to be captured, not word for word. You're not looking at direct quotes and saying Andy said this outrageous statement, right? It's more like a discussion was had. These were some issues that were flagged. There was some dissenting opinion, and ultimately this is what was voted on. So you're sort of sharing that kind of high level version, not all in the weeds of every single, because you don't want minutes that are 10 pages and you don't want minutes that are half a page, is sort of right. So I kind of think it's a, start time of a meeting, end time of a meeting. If you decided on any future actions to take, if there was any reports or documents shared, those are all kinds of typical things you would put in the minutes. Just again, could you give this to somebody who wasn't there? Or if you weren't here a year from now and someone was trying to go back and get a sense of what that discussion looked like, or what history, history of the organization and how it goes about this, could the minutes reflect that? Could you take a look at your minutes and reflect it? And I think that's kind of some of it's an art and some of it's a science. And that's why sometimes the staff and board team on this makes a whole lot of sense, and trying to find that balance. But again, there's some organizations that say fully it is the board secretary and we're not delegating this to staff, and that's fine too. I just think it's, especially with now all of the AI tools, whether you're a fan or not of AI, a lot of people are using that as a tool to help them with board minutes, at least get a first draft down and then refine it. So what have I missed, Andy, or said incorrectly?
I don't think you've said anything incorrectly. I think the first thing you need to do is you need to look at your bylaws, because they may say the secretary takes the minutes, in which case you may need to
Good
change
point.
your bylaws so that it says that the secretary ensures that the minutes are taken. Because the bylaws are the operating system for your nonprofit. You have to follow those. And one of the things that the minutes do is make changes to things like the bylaws, so they need to be accurate. I think what I've seen work really well, because the minutes are something like the auditors are going to look at them when they do their annual financial audit. They're going to ask to see the minutes of the board meetings, because they want to make sure that if the board has said something, that the staff is following that. They're the ones that are going to follow up on things like, well, it says here that you changed your check signing authority so that checks over $10,000 need to have 2 signatures or some other nonsense like that. But then I didn't see that you did it, right? So those are the things that the auditors are going to check for you, or should be checking for you as well. And so for that, and this is more of a philosophy thing than I think a rule, is my opinion would be the minutes need to be as minimal as you can get away with, because it's a legal document that goes along with the rest of everything else. And so like all the stuff that Stacey said that has to be in there, that's the only stuff that I would ever want in there. What time did the meeting start? Who was present? Who wasn't? Did you have a quorum? What reports were given by what people? And then were there any motions, and did the motions carry? Who seconded them, or did any of the motions not carry? So I would kind of disagree on like that there was a discussion that was had. If the board wants to put that in the minutes, if somebody wants to say, I would like to change this motion so that it says XYZ and that we thought this, and then make it part of the motion so that it becomes a permanent record. And any of the conversation doesn't necessarily need to be recorded in your official minutes. And the way I've seen nonprofits do this pretty successfully is to really have 2 sets of minutes. So one is the official one that the board approves at the next meeting that says all of the things that Stacey already said. The other one is a verbatim, more or less verbatim transcript of what actually happened during the meeting, that then the ED and the staff that's responsible for executing those things can look at to make sure that they understand. Because a lot of times your full staff isn't going to be in the board meeting, and somebody may say, oh, the board said this, you have to do that. And so if you have a recording of it and somebody's transcribed the recording, which again is a perfect, I think it's built into Microsoft Word now. There's a transcribe button where you can load a MP3 file and it'll spit out a really accurate transcript of what happened during the meeting. And it even identifies different speakers. It's
That's
really
great.
an interesting tool. So you don't need to spend a ton of time on that full transcript, but just make that available. And then make the minutes themselves really straightforward and really clear about this were the things that happened. I would say that a 1-page set of minutes is probably sufficient. I think Stacey and I may disagree on that. I'd say 1-page minutes are good, but then have a full transcript that's available for staff to look at or to refer back to. If somebody has a problem with the minutes and say, I don't think that's what happened, then you have the full transcript, either a recording or something, or it's like, well, this is what it thinks you said. Do we need to adjust the minutes to make it say something different? To go back, we've gone very far afield from the original question. Should the secretary do it? Maybe. Can staff do it? Sure. It's just a conversation that you're going to have with your ED is like, I really, I want to pay attention during the meeting and I want to have to take notes and I don't want to have to be responsible for the tape recorder because I'm a very busy lady, right? Whatever the reason is.
Right.
Make that pitch and see if you can get a staff member to man the recorder and then dump it into Word for the transcript and then send something to you to approve, I guess.
I just want to piggyback off 2 things you said. So one, thank you for bringing it back to the bylaws. I sort of just skipped over that piece, but yeah, like everything, right? Bylaws are your go-to for these kinds of things, and just seeing and I tend to. And again, someone would probably push back on this. I mean, if you have hard and fast rules, it has to be your board secretary who does it, then yeah, your bylaws should say that it's the secretary's job. But I tend to lean toward bylaws that use language more like the secretary keeps or causes to be kept, right? Like the minutes of a meeting, so that you have that flexibility. So you're not having to change it if things change based on the secretary. So I don't know, that tends to be more where I err, but thank you for just reminding people about the bylaws, Andy. And yeah, I don't want to say, I guess I'm not thinking along. I'm thinking maybe 2 pages. So if we're getting into pages, like I was like, can we compromise? Can I have half a more page?
Single space, double spaced. What font size
right.
do they need to be in?
And I do agree. You have to be careful because it is a legal document and it is a legal record. But I also think and if you have that copy of that separate like transcript or the really detailed one, then Andy, maybe that solves what my concern is. I think that's a really good point, right? Like that solves it because what happens is when you keep it just to the bare minimum of what we're talking about, you lose some context that it can be valuable when you go back to the office. And so I do believe that whether you choose to put a little more in your minutes, and again, I am not advocating for getting into details like from a liability perspective. I wouldn't be naming certain people like that. I think it's about a general, like we had a robust discussion and here were some of the counter arguments made and here were some of the arguments made. And ultimately we landed on this. Like, I think there's a way to do that in minutes that you're protecting yourself and actually showing you're doing due diligence and not just making a vote without some of the key discussion points. So I actually think that protects you in some cases if you do that the right way and show we actually had a lot of thought around this and we're doing our duty of care by really thinking about this from all these angles without making that a book. And that's hard. Most people tend to get into that and then it becomes a book. So, but to your point, maybe the solution, it's a simple one. Like we got 2 sets. We got our detailed behind the scenes set. That is not what we're giving to the auditors or we're giving to funders when they say, I want a year's worth of your minutes or whatever. Like so that kind of keeps it cleaner. So I think it's a great idea, Andy.
Yeah, I think the challenge with that there's a slippery slope when you don't make them as minimal as possible. And that's where do you draw the line with conversation about what happened? I mean, are we including stage directions at this point? Like Mrs. Brooks got up and stood and looked out the window when she voted, right? Like, is that important information or do we need to leave that out? Like, did she have a sarcastic look on her face? What do we need to include? And so just making it just the vote, and then if it's in the transcript someplace else, you have a recording, maybe that's the level of detail that you want to hang on to. But yeah, I think I'm going to stick with minimal. That's going to be my vote.
Well, and you kind of moved me in that direction a little, but I'm still hungry for a little more than that. But yeah, anyway.
How boring would this podcast be if we didn't occasionally disagree?
I know.
If we were just yeah, everybody's always right.
I know, right? I love it. So, and I do love the separate notes as a tool for tasks. Here's here's the action items. Here's the people who volunteered or said they're going to do it. Sometimes that just comes up during board meetings. And then you go, wait a minute, who said what or who's going to do what? Great. That's on your separate meeting notes. So anyway, all right. I think you're moving me in your direction, but we'll see. I'm not gonna admit that fully yet.
We are looking at some creative succession planning models, and we've heard from our peers that a co-executive director model is gaining in popularity. What are the pros and cons of these type of models?
Oh, I love this question because these are becoming more typical, and I know of many organizations looking at succession planning and leadership transitions and trying to figure out what is the next leadership model look like. So thank you for asking it. And I think some of the pros and positives with this, and at least from what I've heard, people who've used it, as well as what the field and sector are saying, is there's an opportunity to have a richness in decision-making that isn't there with one person, right? If you bring 2 different people with 2 different backgrounds, lived experiences, expertise, and you bring them together to make a decision, it helps just enrich, I think, in many ways, right? The decision and the thoughtfulness and looking at it from different sides and angles. So the power isn't all wrapped up in just one person. It is it is really diffused among two people. And it takes time though, right? Like, so there's one of the cons of it is that, it's a lot easier for one person to just say, yeah, let's move forward with this or let's not, and make that decision. So there's more time involved oftentimes with these kinds of models. So some people look at that as a con. A lot of people are talking about burnout and that they can't, one person can't be all things to all people, or they feel really lonely at the top. So another advantage or, positive pro of it is that you feel less alone, right? You've got a thought partner. You've got someone who you are united and in this together. And that there's some comfort, I think. And I think that actually helps from a burnout standpoint and from just carrying all of the weight of the organization on your shoulders. So I think that's a huge positive. And the idea that, kind of that concept of, we're better together than we are alone. Like what together we can accomplish more than one person can accomplish alone. It also, there's oftentimes some of the research is showing that like it cultivates more innovation and growth because again, you've got two minds at the table. And the idea behind this co-ed model, and there's probably a lot, there's a lot of ways you could structure it, but where I've seen it traditionally happen is you have, instead of that one full-time person that has the executive director or CEO title, you call it a co-ed title and you put them, oftentimes there's one that's more external facing and one that's more internal facing. You slice and dice it the way you based on the people's strengths and sort of backgrounds. But there is also a huge overlap between both of them. So like both of them absolutely need to make some decisions together. I've seen some organizations that say fundraising is going to be shared between both because it's important enough, and we don't want all of that burden to fall on one person's shoulders. So you've got to be thoughtful and you've got to get so clear on what are each person's roles, where do they have the power to make the decision without conferring with the other, at what point do they meet with their colleague, their fellow co-ed to talk through it. Do they have the trust and relationship and respect for that other person to actually make this model work? Some organizations don't have that. And I have heard more horror stories than not of organizations where this model fails completely because you have two people who didn't know each other and don't work well together. I think these models tend to work well when you have sort of that next level of leadership in an organization and when an ED is leaving or retiring and you've got maybe two strong people internally, like who've already worked together. They know how each other are wired. They respect and trust each other. Like that's where I see these models really work well. Otherwise, like the con, right? It can be completely confusing. Staff can get confused if there's not crystal clear, right? Like this is where we share decision making. This is who you go to for this. And it's an adjustment, right? Like staff are used to going to one person depending on how you're structured. The other thing is and I guess a con would be, so, the pros, right? You help avoid burnout, you feel less alone, there's more room for diversity of thought and experience and more rich decision-making, more innovation and growth potentially. It also can create a more collaborative mindset for the organization as a whole. So it just changes the culture of the organization. So those are what I would just rattle off as the pros. The cons, right? It can be super confusing to staff and to the board. And the board not really knowing how that's handled. If you do not have two people who are equally committed and there's not some accountability structure in place for that, it can also be a nightmare, right? You've got the one co-ed who shirks responsibility and really is just in name only where the other one carries the heavy burden. Oh my gosh, none of us want that, right? We've all been in those situations where we're like, this sucks. I'm doing the job of the other person and they're getting the pay and the credit for it, right? I also think it can just be kind of more of a, you have to watch out. It doesn't become like a de facto ED position, with one really being the ED and the other not. And so I think those are some of the cons. It really, though, the other thing is organizations assume that by a co-ed model, that means, I just take the salary and cut it in half. No. Andy, you're laughing. Can you can you see that thinking though, right? Like organizations.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I hadn't until you said it. As soon as you said it, I'm like, of course, that's what they would do.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And boards are like, cool. Like I only have to pay whatever, 60 grand each or 70 grand each instead of 120 or 40. So that's not, just for anyone listening, that's not acceptable, right? Like this is an ED position. So it's actually can cost more, right? Like it's a bigger investment, but it's also an investment in having some bench strength so that when you've got two really solid, strong people. And, this could be a longer conversation on leadership structures because there's a lot of ways to slice this. But I think the co-ed movement and model came from realizing that, the current one is a struggle for a lot of organizations. And there's a lot of EDs that are just like, I don't want to be an ED. This is too much. Like I'm carrying too much. And so lots of variables for that. There's a good article that we can put in show notes that there's a ton of articles on it these days, but one in particular that used 5 organizations. I think it's a few years old, from Nonprofit Quarterly, but they talked to 5 organizations who employed this model and talked to them about the realities of what worked, what didn't. Definitely not something to take lightly. It's more complicated. Let's just be clear here. It's more complicated because there's a lot there. It's 2 people instead of 1, right? I don't know, Andy, do you know anyone who's gone through this, or have you heard of people doing this?
I've seen it. I've never encountered it in the wild, right? I know organizations that have done it, but I haven't been like deeply engaged with them. I think the one thing you mentioned, I had like quick flashbacks from college team projects, right? Where you have to do all the work because everybody else is just going to coast. It seems like the most terrifying option. But I mean, I think I like to think about, one of the things that we always talk about is that nonprofits are not just regular for-profit corporations with a couple of different rules. They're really completely different animals. There's things that are 100% different from the corporate sector, but we just copy their practices because we do. And org charts are one of them. And nobody really thinks deeply about org charts. There's like, well, we've picked this way, which is based on the Royal Navy from 1780. And this is just how everything is. There's an admiral, and under the admiral are some captains, and under the captains are lieutenants. And that's just how we roll. And it's been that way since the beginning of time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the thing that makes the most sense just because it's been the way that it's been done for a million years. I know all EDs and board chairs hate it when somebody says, well, that's just how we've always done it, right? And this is one of those scenarios where that's just how we've always done it, right? And nobody ever wants to change it because it seems scary. I'm all for experimenting. I love the idea of having a thought partner, somebody that you can bounce ideas off that's got the same skin in the game that you do, rather than having to rely on an external expert or talking to your board who really have, from agency theory, really have different priorities than you do. So yeah, I'd say go for it. Think about all of the options. Think about your org chart deeply. And is there a new way to do it that makes sense for you? I love the idea. Thanks for listening, everybody. We appreciate that you've taken the time out of your busy schedule to join Stacey and I for a half an hour so we can talk about nonprofit stuff. Send us questions. Nonprofiteverything.com is the website, so that you can ask questions by clicking the button there, or you can just email it to questions@nonprofiteverything.com. That works too. Or bug Stacey or bug me. If you can find us, we're not that hard to find. And we will get your question in the queue to be answered next time. Thanks for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks.